The sun was low in the Arizona sky, and the wind carried fine dust across the empty land. Luke, a quiet cowboy with calloused hands and a calm heart, stood by the corral tightening the ropes on his fence. It had been a long day of fixing troughs, brushing horses, and checking the water lines. The land stretched far and wide around him, dry but peaceful. He liked it that way, just him, the sound of the wind, and the soft breath of the animals. But that afternoon, something changed. From the edge of the dirt road, he saw a small shape moving slowly toward the ranch. At first he thought it might be a lost traveler or maybe a ranch hand from town. As the figure came closer, he could see it was a woman. Her clothes were dusty and torn, her boots nearly worn through. The wind tugged at her hair, dark and tangled with sand. Her face was tired and her steps dragged like each one hurt. She looked like she had been walking for days under the desert sun. Luke leaned on the fence, watching her carefully. Travelers sometimes came by asking for food or water, and he usually helped if he could. But this woman didn't look like the kind who begged. She walked with her head high even though her body looked weak. When she reached the gate, she stopped, caught her breath, and looked straight at him. Her voice was soft but steady. "I only have $3, she said. "Let me wash at your ranch, cowboy." Luke blinked, unsure he heard her right. She wasn't asking for a meal or a bed. She just wanted to wash. Her hands were shaking slightly, and her face had lines of dust where sweat had dried. But there was something proud in her tone, something that made Luke pause before answering. He wiped his hands on his jeans and walked toward her. "You came a long way?" he asked. She nodded once. "Long enough." Luke looked down at the 3 crumpled dollar bills in her hand. They were dirty and worn, like they had been through miles of dust and struggle. He thought of how far she must have walked, how thirsty she must be. "You don't need to pay to wash," he said after a moment. "Water's out back. There's a pump by the barn, go on." She hesitated, like she wasn't sure if he was serious. But when she saw he meant it, she gave a small nod of thanks and walked toward the pump. Her movements were slow, careful. Luke stayed where he was, pretending to fix the fence, but his eyes followed her quietly. At the pump, she turned the handle, and cold water rushed out, splashing over her hands. She gasped softly, maybe from the chill, maybe from relief. The dust started to wash away, turning the ground beneath her feet muddy. She cupped her hands and splashed water on her face again and again, as if trying to wash off more than just dirt. Luke saw her pause for a moment, her shoulders trembling. He couldn't tell if she was crying or just tired. The desert could do that to anyone. It took strength to survive out here. He thought of offering her a towel or some food, but something told him not to interrupt. Sometimes people needed a moment of peace more than they needed words. When she finally stopped, she stood still for a long moment, looking up at the sky. Then she took a deep breath and turned back toward him. Her face was cleaner now, and for the first time, he noticed her features properly. She had sharp cheekbones, deep brown eyes, and a quiet strength that reminded him of the old stories his grandmother used to tell. Stories about the Apache women who never bowed to hardship. She walked back to him, holding the $3 out again. "I said I'd pay," she murmured. Luke shook his head. "Keep it," he said simply. Her brows furrowed. "I don't take charity." "It's not charity," he said softly. "It's just water. No one should have to pay for that." For a moment, neither of them spoke. The wind whistled through the dry grass and the horses shifted in the corral, their tails flicking at flies. Luke saw the way her hand tightened around the money before she finally lowered it. "I'm Alona," she said after a while. Her voice had lost some of its roughness, and there was a small spark of pride in her tone again. "Luke," he replied. She nodded once in thanks. "You have a kind heart, Luke." He shrugged, embarrassed by the words. Just doing what anyone would. But deep down, he knew not everyone would. People out there were quick to judge, especially when they saw someone who looked different, someone from the old tribes. Luke didn't care much about where people came from. To him, a person's heart mattered more than their name or skin. Alona moved to sit on the wooden rail of the fence, resting her tired feet. Luke noticed the faint scars on her arms and the sunburn on her neck. Life had not been easy on her. "You from around here?" he asked. She shook her head. "Farther south. The floods took my home. I walked north hoping to find work." Luke nodded slowly. He'd heard about the floods in the valleys that washed away small villages. People had lost everything. It made sense now. The worn boots, the dusty face, the pride in her voice even when she had nothing but $3. As they stood there, a soft orange glow spread over the horizon. The desert looked peaceful again, though it hid its harshness behind that beauty. Luke thought about how lonely it could get, how quiet the nights were when the only sounds came from the crickets and the wind through the grass. "Do you have somewhere to go?" he asked finally. Alona hesitated. "The next town, maybe. If I can make it by morning." He frowned slightly. The next town was more than 20 miles away, and the night could turn cold fast. Coyotes roamed, and the roads weren't safe for walking alone. "You can stay in the barn tonight," he said. "It's clean enough and the horses don't mind company." She looked at him for a long moment, as if trying to decide whether to trust him. Then she nodded. "I'll pay for that too, when I can." "No need," Luke said again, smiling faintly. "Just rest." Alona gave a quiet thank you, almost a whisper, and walked toward the barn. Luke watched her go, the last light of the sunset painting her figure in gold and shadow. For some reason, he felt something stir inside him, something he hadn't felt in a long time. Maybe it was pity or maybe it was respect. When the night came, Luke sat on his porch looking up at the stars. He could hear the faint sound of water dripping from the pump and the horses shifting in their stalls. The world was still and quiet again, but not quite the same. Somewhere inside the barn, a tired woman slept with a roof over her head for the first time in many nights. Luke leaned back in his chair and whispered to himself, $3 and a heart full of courage. He smiled softly, knowing the desert had brought a stranger to his gate for a reason. That night the cowboy felt less alone under the wide, endless sky. The next morning came softly. The first light of dawn spread across the horizon, turning the sky from dark blue to gentle gold. The roosters crowed and the horses began to stir in the barn. Luke woke up early as always. He pulled on his boots and went outside, feeling the cool air before the heat of the day began. Dust floated in the early sunlight and the smell of hay filled the air. He liked mornings like this, quiet, simple, and calm. But as he walked toward the barn, he noticed something unexpected. Alona was already awake. She wasn't sleeping or resting. She was working. She had found a broom and was sweeping the barn floor, moving slowly but with care. Her hair was still a little messy, but her eyes looked more alive than yesterday. Luke stood at the doorway for a moment, watching her. She looked like someone who had worked hard her whole life and didn't know how to stop, even when no one asked her to. "You don't have to do that," Luke said finally. Alona turned, her hand still holding the broom. "I stayed here for the night. It's only fair I leave it cleaner than I found it." Luke smiled a little. "Fair enough," he said. "You hungry?" Her eyes flicked toward him, then to the ground. "If you don't mind," she said quietly. He nodded toward the house. "Come on. There's food." Inside, Luke warmed some leftover beans and sliced bread. It wasn't much, but it was warm, and the smell filled the small kitchen. Alona sat at the table, her hands folded, waiting. She looked around the room, noticing the worn wooden walls, the few pictures on the shelf, and the hat hanging by the door. Everything was simple, but it felt full of life. Luke set the food in front of her. "Eat," he said. She didn't rush. She ate slowly, as if each bite mattered. Luke poured her coffee, and she smiled faintly. "It's been a long time since I had a meal like this," she said. He sat across from her, curious. "Where were you headed?" "North," she said after a pause. "They said there's a town that needs workers for the fields. I thought maybe I could earn enough to start again." Luke nodded. "That's a long walk from here." "I know," she said softly. "But I didn't have much choice." Her words were simple, but they carried a deep weight. Luke could see it in her eyes, the quiet pain of someone who had lost more than she wanted to say. She didn't complain, didn't ask for sympathy. That made him respect her even more. After breakfast, Luke went outside to fix a fence near the north pasture. He didn't ask Alona to help, but after a few minutes she came out and stood beside him. Without a word, she picked up fallen wood and handed him the tools. She worked like she belonged there. Luke said nothing, but inside he was surprised. Most people he had helped before would leave as soon as they got what they wanted. But Alona was different. The sun climbed higher and the air grew hot. Sweat ran down Luke's face as he hammered nails into the old boards. Alona carried water from the pump and handed it to him. Her hands were rough and her skin sunburned, but she didn't stop working. When the fence was fixed, they both sat under the shade of an old mesquite tree. Luke glanced at her. "You're a hard worker," he said. She smiled faintly. "Work is what keeps me alive," she replied. He nodded slowly, understanding that simple truth. Out here in the desert, everyone had to work hard to survive. Still, he couldn't help but wonder what kind of life she had before this, before she became a wanderer with $3 and no home. When the afternoon came, Luke went to feed the horses. Alona followed quietly. The horses were uneasy at first, not used to strangers, but she moved slowly, speaking to them in a low, gentle tone. Luke watched as one of the nervous mares took a step toward her, sniffing her hand. It surprised him. That horse didn't trust anyone easily. "You've been around animals before," Luke said. Alona nodded. "My father taught me. We had horses, too. He said they understand hearts better than words." Luke smiled. Sounds like he was right. She looked down, a small shadow crossing her face.
"He was a good man," she said softly.
But life took him early. Luke didn't ask what had happened. Some stories didn't need to be told. He just nodded, and together they brushed the horses until the sun began to set again. That evening, Luke cooked dinner. Nothing fancy, just beans, potatoes, and some dried meat. They ate outside near the porch, watching the desert turn orange and red. The silence between them was peaceful. The wind carried the smell of dust and sage. After a while, Alona spoke. "You didn't have to let me stay," she said, "or give me food." Luke looked at her. "You didn't ask for pity. You just wanted a place to wash. That was enough for me," she smiled softly. "Most men wouldn't have done what you did." He shrugged. "Maybe most men forget what kindness feels like." Her eyes softened at that. She looked out at the land, where the sun had almost disappeared. "The desert is cruel sometimes," she said quietly, "but it also shows who people really are." Luke thought about that for a moment. It was true. The land didn't lie. It tested every person who tried to live on it, tested their patience, their faith, and their heart. When the stars began to appear, Alona stood up. "I'll sleep in the barn again if that's all right." Luke nodded. "Of course." She hesitated, then said, "Thank you, Luke, for not turning me away." He smiled faintly. "You'd have done the same if it were me." Alona looked at him for a moment longer, then walked toward the barn, her steps quiet in the soft dust. Luke watched her go, feeling that same strange pull in his chest he couldn't quite name. Maybe it was respect, or maybe something deeper, something that came from seeing another soul who had survived the desert's hardest days. Later that night, Luke sat again on the porch. The stars were bright and the air was still. He could hear the faint sound of the horses moving in the barn, and the soft hum of the wind through the grass. He thought about Alona, how she had walked all that way, how she had refused to give up her pride, even when she had almost nothing left. He had seen strong men break under less. But she stood firm. Luke leaned back, his hat low over his eyes, thinking about how some people arrived in your life without warning, like a windstorm you didn't expect but somehow needed. He didn't know what would happen tomorrow, whether she would leave or stay, but for the first time in a long while, the ranch didn't feel so empty. Inside the barn, Alona lay on a blanket of hay looking up at the wooden ceiling. The faint smell of horses and warm air surrounded her. For the first time in many nights, she wasn't afraid. She whispered a quiet prayer in her language, thanking the spirits for guiding her steps to this place. And somewhere outside, under the same stars, Luke whispered to himself, "Sometimes, $3 can bring more change than gold." The wind blew softly across the land, carrying the quiet promise of a new beginning neither of them yet understood. The next day started like any other on the ranch. The morning air was cool and the sky stretched wide and endless above the desert. Luke saddled his horse and checked the fences while Alona carried buckets of water to the troughs. They didn't talk much, but the silence between them was easy. It wasn't the quiet of strangers anymore. It was the kind that felt natural, like they had worked side by side for years. By noon, the sun was burning bright and both of them were covered in dust. Luke wiped the sweat from his brow and glanced at Alona. She was still working, her sleeves rolled up, her hands steady even though her face showed the heat's weariness. He could tell she was pushing herself hard, maybe too hard. "You can rest," he said gently. "The desert's not going anywhere." She smiled faintly. "I rest when the work's done." He chuckled softly. "You sound like me." Alona looked at him, a little surprised, then smiled more openly than before. It was a rare smile, one that reached her eyes. For the first time, Luke saw what she might have looked like before the dust and hardship. There was something peaceful in her face when she smiled, something that made him forget for a moment how empty the desert could feel. When they stopped for lunch, Luke cooked beans and cornbread on the small fire near the corral. Alona sat across from him, her eyes fixed on the flickering flames. After a while, she said quietly, "You probably wonder why I walked all this way." Luke looked up but didn't say anything. He just waited. Alona stared at the fire for a few seconds before she spoke again. "My home was a small place near the river. My people lived there for generations. But last year a flood came. The water took everything. The houses, the horses, even the fields." Her voice trembled slightly, but she didn't stop. "I lost my family that night. My father, my little brother. I tried to save them, but the water came too fast." Luke's chest tightened. He wanted to say something, but he knew words couldn't fix that kind of pain. He just nodded slowly. "I walked north," she continued. "At first I thought I could find someone I knew. But the world doesn't look kindly on people like me. In the towns, they turned me away. Some laughed. Some threw stones." Her eyes darkened at the memory, but she stayed calm. "When I saw your ranch from the hill, I almost kept walking. I didn't want to ask for help again. But I hadn't eaten in 2 days. And when I saw the water pump, I thought maybe I could wash and feel human again." Luke looked down at his hands. "You didn't look weak that day," he said quietly. "You looked like someone still standing after the storm." Alona's lips curved into a small, grateful smile. "Maybe the storm didn't win yet," she said softly. For a moment, they both sat in silence, listening to the wind move through the dry grass. The sound was gentle, like a whisper between the hills. Luke thought about how lonely she must have felt walking all that way alone, carrying only hope and $3. After lunch, they worked together fixing a broken wagon wheel near the barn. Luke showed her how to fit the metal rim properly, and Alona watched carefully, learning fast. When the job was done, she stood back and smiled. "It's strange," she said. "It feels good to fix something again. Feels like taking control back, doesn't it?" Luke replied. She nodded. "Yes. Like maybe not everything is gone." As the day went on, the wind picked up and the sky grew darker. Clouds rolled in from the west, thick, heavy clouds that promised rain. Luke looked toward the horizon and frowned. "Storm's coming," he said. "A big one." Alona's face paled slightly. Storm still scared her. The memory of the flood was something she carried deep inside. Luke noticed her tense shoulders and the way her eyes followed the dark clouds. "It's all right," he said gently. "This one's just rain, not a flood. You're safe here." She gave a small nod, but her hands still shook slightly. When the first drops began to fall, they both hurried to move the tools and feed under shelter. By the time they were done, the rain was coming down hard, drumming on the barn roof. Inside the barn, they sat together near the horses. The sound of rain filled the air, steady and comforting. Alona hugged her knees and listened. Her eyes closed for a moment, and she whispered something softly in her language. A prayer, maybe, or a thank you. Luke watched her quietly. The firelight from the small lantern made her face glow softly, and for the first time, she looked at peace. "This sound used to scare me," she said, opening her eyes. "Now it sounds like a song." Luke nodded. "Maybe it's the land saying it remembers you." She tilted her head, thoughtful. "You believe that?" He smiled. "I believe the land never forgets the people who respect it." Alona smiled back. "Then maybe it hasn't forgotten me." They both laughed softly. The rain kept falling, tapping against the roof like the steady rhythm of an old lullaby. Hours passed before the rain began to ease. Luke stood up and checked the barn doors. "We'll be all right," he said. "You can rest now." But Alona shook her head. "I can't rest when the sky is angry. I used to think the storms were warnings." Luke looked at her for a moment. Maybe they're reminders, he said, that we survived. Her eyes softened. You talk like an old spirit, Luke, he chuckled. Maybe the desert made me one. They shared a quiet smile before sitting back down. The smell of wet earth filled the air. Luke handed her his jacket when he noticed her shiver, and she took it carefully as if it were something precious. Thank you, she said. Don't mention it. When the storm finally ended, they stepped outside together. The air was cool and clean, and the land smelled fresh again. Tiny streams of rainwater ran down the road, sparkling under the moonlight. Alona looked up at the sky, her hair damp, her eyes reflecting the stars. It's strange, she said softly. The rain used to take everything from me, but tonight it feels like it gave something back. Luke nodded. Maybe it washed away what you didn't need anymore. She turned to him, her gaze steady. And what do you think it left behind? He smiled. Strength, and maybe a new beginning. Alona looked away, her eyes glistening, though not from tears this time. She breathed deeply as if filling her lungs with hope. That night she didn't sleep in the barn. Luke offered her the small spare room in the house, and she accepted after some hesitation. The next morning when he stepped outside, he saw her already working again, her hands busy mending old tools. Luke realized something had changed, not just in her but in the ranch itself. The air felt lighter. The place didn't seem so quiet anymore, and though neither of them said it out loud, they both knew something important had begun, a connection built not from words but from shared silence, trust, and the simple kindness that had started with 3 crumpled dollars and a bucket of cold water. Days turned into weeks on the ranch, and the dry desert around them began to change. The rains had left the air fresh, and small green shoots started pushing through the cracked soil. Luke noticed how alive the land looked now, and he thought, maybe it wasn't just the rain that brought it back. Maybe it was Alona too. Ever since she arrived, the ranch didn't feel so empty anymore. The silence that used to hang heavy now felt calm and full. Every morning, Alona woke up before sunrise. She helped with the animals, gathered eggs from the chicken coop, and brushed the horses until their coats shone in the golden light. She had a soft way with animals, a quiet patience that even the wildest horse seemed to understand. Luke watched her sometimes from a distance, noticing how the horses followed her with trust. One morning, Luke came to the barn and found Alona teaching a young colt to walk with a rope. The colt had been born weak and scared of people, but under her gentle hand it took small, brave steps. You've got a gift, Luke said, leaning on the barn door. Alona smiled slightly. It's not a gift, she said. It's listening. Horses don't talk, but they speak in other ways. Luke nodded. Guess I've still got a lot to learn. You've already learned one important thing, she said. Kindness. Her words made him pause. He wasn't used to compliments, and something in her voice felt warm and honest. He gave a small smile and looked away, pretending to adjust the rope hanging on the wall. By midday, they worked side by side, repairing the windmill. The sun was strong again, and dust rose with every step. Luke climbed the wooden ladder, and Alona stayed below, handing him tools. The work was steady, and they spoke little, but every glance, every small exchange of words built a quiet rhythm between them. When the job was done, Luke climbed down and wiped the sweat from his face. That'll keep the water flowing for another year, he said. Alona nodded. It's good work, she said. The kind that lasts. They shared a small laugh, and Luke suddenly realized he couldn't remember the last time he'd laughed so easily. Later that afternoon, Luke saddled his horse and asked, Want to ride out to the ridge? The view's good after rain. Alona hesitated, but then nodded. I haven't been on a horse in a long time. Luke helped her up onto a gentle mare named Daisy. She sat awkwardly at first, but as the horse began to walk, her old balance returned. They rode quietly through the open land, the wind brushing against their faces. The desert stretched endlessly, painted with gold and orange. When they reached the ridge, they stopped. From there, they could see miles of rolling land, the faint line of the river, and the sunset glowing behind the mountains. Alona's eyes softened. This place, she whispered. It feels alive again. Luke nodded. So do I. She looked at him, her expression full of quiet understanding. They didn't need more words after that. The silence between them said enough. That evening, as they rode back, Luke noticed Alona humming softly. The tune was old and haunting, something from her people, something that spoke of the earth and sky. He didn't ask about it, but he knew it meant peace. When they reached the ranch, the light was fading. Luke built a fire outside, and they sat together while the stars began to appear. The flames danced in the night, casting warm light on their faces. Alona poked the fire with a stick. "I used to sing that song when I was a child," she said quietly. "My father said it would keep storms away." Luke smiled. "Looks like it's working so far." She laughed softly, and the sound made the night feel even warmer. As days passed, Alona became part of the ranch life completely. She took care of the garden behind the house, planting herbs and wildflowers she found in the hills. Luke helped her build small fences to protect the plants from the wind. Slowly, color returned to the dusty yard. Green leaves, yellow blooms, and the smell of life again. One morning, Luke walked out and found her kneeling by the flowers, talking softly to them in her language. He didn't understand the words, but the sound was gentle and full of love. "Are you praying?" he asked. Alona smiled without looking up. "No, just thanking them for growing." Luke chuckled. "Never thought of thanking plants before." She looked up at him with a grin. "Maybe that's why they don't grow much for you." He laughed, shaking his head. "You might be right." That afternoon, a traveler stopped by, a supply wagon heading to the next town. Luke bought feed and flour, and Alona traded a small handmade necklace she had made from desert stones. The traveler looked at her curiously and said, "You don't see many Apache women out this far." Luke noticed the way Alona's shoulders stiffened, but before she could reply, he spoke calmly. "She belongs here now. This is her home." The traveler nodded and went on his way, but Alona stood quiet for a moment. "You didn't have to say that," she said softly. "Yes, I did," Luke answered, "because it's true." She looked at him for a long moment, her eyes shining in the afternoon light. Then she whispered, "Thank you, Luke." That night she cooked dinner for him for the first time, an old recipe from her people. The food smelled rich and smoky, and Luke couldn't help but smile as he tasted it. "You could open a kitchen in town," he said. "They'd line up for this." She laughed. "I'm not sure the town would want me there." "They'd be lucky to have you," Luke replied. Alona looked at him, touched by his words. For the first time in a long while, she felt like she belonged somewhere, not just as a guest, but as part of something real. As the weeks went by, their days found a gentle rhythm. They worked together, ate together, and talked in the evenings about simple things: the weather, the horses, the stars. Luke told her stories about his younger days as a cattle hand, and Alona told him tales her father used to share about the desert spirits who guarded the land. Sometimes when she laughed, Luke found himself watching her longer than he meant to. Her laughter reminded him of spring rain after a dry spell, rare and beautiful. One evening, while repairing a saddle, Luke said quietly, "You know, the ranch feels different since you came." She looked at him with curiosity. "Different how?" He thought for a moment. "Alive. Lighter." Alona smiled. "Maybe it just needed a little dust to wake it up." He laughed softly. "Maybe it needed someone with courage." Their eyes met and something unspoken passed between them, a warmth, a quiet knowing. The night wind rustled the leaves and the sound of crickets filled the air. As darkness settled over the land, Luke realized that what had begun as an act of kindness had grown into something far greater. The woman who had once asked to wash away the dust at his ranch had somehow washed away the loneliness in his heart, and though neither of them said it aloud, they both understood that the ranch was no longer just his. It was theirs now, bound by work, by trust, and by something even deeper that neither dared to name just yet. The months rolled by and life on the ranch found a steady peace. The air grew cooler as autumn touched the desert. painting the sky with softer light. Each morning began with the sound of roosters crowing and the smell of fresh coffee. Luke would saddle his horse while Alona fed the chickens and swept the yard. The ranch had become alive again, not just with work but with laughter and quiet moments that made it feel like home. Luke often caught himself smiling when he watched Alona. She moved with calm grace, every motion sure and patient. Sometimes she sang softly while working, old songs in her native tongue that blended with the whisper of the wind. He didn't understand the words, but the melody stayed with him long after. It reminded him that even the desert, dry and harsh, could still hold music. One morning, as Luke fixed a broken fence near the south pasture, he saw Alona walking toward him. She carried a small wooden box wrapped in a piece of cloth. When she reached him, she handed it over. "What's this?" Luke asked, surprised. She smiled faintly. "A gift. Something I made." He opened the box and found a carved wooden figure inside, a small horse, shaped carefully from desert wood. Every line and curve was detailed. The horse looked strong and proud, its mane flowing as if caught in motion. "It's beautiful," Luke said softly. "You made this?" Alona nodded. "My father taught me to carve when I was little. He said if you carve with patience, you give life to the wood." Luke held the carving carefully like it was made of glass. "Then you've given this one a soul," he said. "Thank you, Alona." She looked down, her cheeks warming. "It's a thank you for the water," she said quietly. "For the roof. For believing I was more than just a wanderer." Luke smiled. "You don't owe me anything." "Maybe not," she replied, "but sometimes it feels right to give back." From that day, the carved horse sat on the shelf near Luke's fireplace. Every time he saw it, he remembered the first day she came, dusty, tired, holding those $3. He still had those crumpled bills tucked away in a drawer untouched. Somehow they had become more than money. They were the beginning of everything that followed. As winter came closer, the air turned cold in the evenings. Luke started lighting the fireplace again. One night, as the fire crackled, Alona sat on the floor near the warmth, weaving a blanket from wool she had gathered from a nearby ranch. Luke sat nearby reading an old book, though he found himself watching her more than the pages. The firelight danced across her face, and for the first time, he noticed how peaceful she looked, like the long road she had walked no longer haunted her. "Do you ever miss your old home?" he asked softly. She looked into the fire. "Sometimes," she said, "but I think I was meant to find this one." Luke's heart stirred. "This one?" She nodded slowly. "This ranch. This place. It feels like the land remembers me." He smiled quietly. "Then maybe it was waiting for you." Outside, the wind howled gently against the windows. Inside, everything felt warm and safe. They talked late into the night, sharing stories about their past, their mistakes, their hopes, the things they never told anyone. It was the kind of talk that only happened between people who had learned to trust each other completely. The next morning, frost covered the ground. Luke went outside to check the water troughs, and when he came back, he found Alona at the table with the same $3 bills. They were folded neatly and placed in front of her. "What are you doing with those?" he asked. Alona looked up, smiling softly. "You gave me a place when I had nothing. I kept these to remind myself of that day. But now I think it's time I return them." Luke shook his head immediately. "No, Alona, keep them. They're yours." She pushed them toward him gently. "No, I want you to have them. Not as payment, but as a memory. So you never forget that kindness can start with very little." Luke looked at the old bills for a long moment, then back at her. Her eyes were calm, steady, full of warmth. Slowly, he closed her hand around the money again. "Then you keep them," he said softly, "because you're the one who proved what kindness can become." For a moment, they just looked at each other, neither speaking. The morning light fell across the table, turning everything golden. It was a simple moment, but it felt like something sacred. As the days passed, Alona stayed on the ranch, not as a guest, but as part of it. She managed the small garden, cared for the animals, and helped Luke run the place as if it had always been her home. Together, they rebuilt the fences, repaired the barn roof, and even painted the house's old walls. The once lonely ranch now stood strong and full of life. One evening, after a long day of work, Luke and Alona sat outside watching the sunset. The sky was painted with orange and red, the kind of view that made the world look endless. The horses grazed nearby, and the air smelled of dry sage and warmth. Alona looked at the horizon and said softly, "I used to think life only took things away, but maybe it also gives back just in its own time. Luke nodded. Sometimes it gives more than we expect. She smiled. Like peace. He glanced at her and said quietly, or like family. Her eyes glistened a little. Family, she repeated, almost as if testing the word. It's been a long time since I had one. You do now, Luke said simply. A soft wind brushed past them, carrying the smell of the land they both now called home. Weeks later, the ranch held a small gathering. A few neighbors came by to help with the cattle drive. They brought food, music, and laughter. For the first time in years, Luke's ranch was full of voices and joy. Alona helped serve food and joined in the songs around the fire. Her laughter carried across the night, blending with the sounds of guitars and crackling wood. At one point, one of the neighbors, an older woman, leaned over to Luke and whispered, "That woman's brought light back to this place." Luke smiled quietly. Yes, she has. After the guests left and the fire turned to embers, Luke and Alona sat together in the calm night. Above them, the stars stretched endlessly, just like the night she first arrived. "Do you remember the day you came here?" Luke asked. Alona nodded. "I remember every step," she said. "I thought I was just looking for water. I didn't know I'd find a home." Luke looked at her for a long moment, then reached into his pocket. He took out the small wooden horse she had carved and handed it to her. "You gave this life," he said, "just like you did for this ranch." She looked at the carving and then back at him, her smile soft and full of emotion. "Then it belongs to both of us." They sat there in silence, watching the sky. The desert wind moved gently, whispering through the grass. Somewhere in that stillness, everything felt right. The land, the stars, and the quiet bond between two people who had both been lost once but had found each other in the vast emptiness of the desert. From that night on, the ranch became more than a place of work. It became a place of hope. Travelers passing by would often stop, drawn by its warmth. Some said the land felt alive, as if it carried a spirit of kindness within it. And every time someone asked about the story of the ranch, Luke would smile and say, "It started with a woman who had only $3 and a heart brave enough to ask for a chance." Alona would laugh softly beside him, her eyes shining. She had washed away more than the dust that first day. She had washed away the loneliness of two souls who never knew they were waiting for each other. The stars watched quietly over the ranch that night, as two hearts finally found peace under the same endless Arizona sky.